Recently I've been reflecting on the whole idea of failure, what it is and why it feels so deflating, and I say this knowing that it's a necessary step in any kind of pursuit. So in this video I'm going to do a deep dive into everything relating to failure and how to come to terms with it. In many ways this video is a diary entry that I'm using to remind myself and reinforce the positive messages so I can keep in mind some of the necessary information along the way, and hopefully it can help you too, especially if you have any kind of long-term goal. So starting with the definition of failure, and failure is the condition of not achieving a desired or intended objective, which often serves as a contrast to success. The last part I find particularly interesting because in a self-contained micro level, this seems to be the case. For example, let's say that you only had one day to live and you made that whole day revolve around a particular race, let's say a marathon, and all that mattered to you is that you win the marathon. But when the time came, you ended up falling short of those expectations, so it might seem like it was a failure. When life is viewed through that lens, it's hard to argue that that was indeed a failure because you based everything on that moment and you only had one opportunity to actually accomplish that goal. But overall, life doesn't operate on that fine-grained micro level, and when stretched out over a larger portion of time, then failure can be viewed as a necessary step to accomplishing any other long-term goal. So why then does failure feel so uncomfortable, even though we all know that it's a necessary step and it's also unavoidable? Well, I've identified three main reasons for this, and the first one is the fear of judgment or social rejection. Because we now live in a relatively safe, equal and prosperous society, it's easy to forget where we came from. And throughout most of human history, things were much more volatile, resources were much more scarce, and making the wrong decision led to much more drastic outcomes. So essentially we've evolved for a world that no longer exists. However, the remnants of these particular behaviors are still very much prevalent, which is why we find social rejection so scary. In the past, being cast out by your family, tribe, or even broader society was essentially a death sentence. So that's why in modern times, we try so hard to avoid this possibility. So as a result, we end up conforming and playing it safe rather than risking anything, even at the expense of our own happiness. The next reason is self-esteem and identity. And every time we fail at something, our egos take a hit, and we often translate and interpret this as being a sense of inadequacy in some kind of area. The interesting paradox about this one is that when we do eventually overcome this obstacle, particularly when we failed many times before, the boost in self-esteem tends to be disproportionate and far outweighs the negative hits to our self-esteem from failing previously. And the last reason is because of cultural or societal expectations. And sometimes this is something that we just feel intuitively rather than something that's explicitly outlined, whereas other times it could be our parents, neighbors, or teachers that impose some very strict requirements that we need to exceed, otherwise we feel like a failure. I think when these expectations are broader, more implicit, and less defined, they're harder to shake because they tend to be all around us, and these invisible forces are constantly impacting us even if we try very hard to resist them. But when these expectations are more narrow and more explicit, for example from family members who have certain career aspirations for you, then the feelings associated could be harder to resist and more profound. I was looking into some case studies recently from three very successful people who had to overcome not so subtle obstacles in order to reach their success, and it was that perseverance that actually led to it in the first place. The first is from the author of the Harry Potter series, J.K. Rowling. And prior to her success, she actually went to a number of publishers and failed 12 times, where each one rejected her proposal and thought that her work wasn't good enough. Only now in hindsight do we know that that wasn't the case, but her perseverance has actually led to her success, and even if she gave up at the 11th attempt, then we wouldn't now have a world where Harry Potter is so popular. The next one is Steve Jobs, and he was actually fired from his own company before moving on to different types of creative work, and then eventually returning to Apple, and that led to the success that we now see today. And the last one is Thomas Edison, and he famously said, "I have not failed, I just found 10,000 ways that won't work." So this leads on to the whole idea about how failure is actually necessary for success, and I think this is best encapsulated with the concept, the 10,000 hour rule. Loosely speaking, this states that in order to become a master or an expert in anything, you have to invest 10,000 hours of your time into that particular activity. What's interesting is that over those 10,000 hours, you see two different mathematical or statistical models at play, and they are the exponential curve and the logarithmic curve. In this particular context, the exponential curve is often referred to as the hockey stick because you start off with a flat line and only after a certain point do you see very rapid growth. The logarithmic curve, on the other hand, is sort of the opposite in that you see a lot of rapid growth at the start, but then over time things start to slow down until you reach a stage where there's very little measurable growth, even though things start to add up over the long term. The way I like to think of it is the logarithmic curve applies to your own learning and development, because if you fail and fail fast, particularly at the start, then you see very rapid growth, and then over time it becomes less measurable because you become more accomplished and you have less to learn. The exponential curve is more related to your actual outcome or your external results. So while you might be learning and developing very rapidly, which is internal, it takes time before this builds up until you reach a point where you seem like an overnight success. And then all of a sudden you grow very rapidly and your successes only go up over time. So we know failure improves your knowledge, your skills, and even your abilities. And this can be best seen in the gym. When you fail to be able to lift a particular weight, it usually signals something like your body's been broken down to some level, but then you end up coming back even stronger the next time. But failure also serves another very important purpose, which is to show you what you don't already know. Because if everything came easily, then it's very easy to assume that you're very competent at that particular thing. But when you fail at something, it shows you firsthand that there's something or somewhere that you need to improve. The last thing that failure does is build resilience. Because each time you fail, and if you come out relatively unscathed the other side, then it proves to yourself that you have the mental stamina and the resilience to sustain that kind of failure, but also that it gives you some kind of self-esteem and confidence knowing that you have that self-belief to persevere regardless. So I'm making this video, and it might beg the question, what's actually prompting it? Why is failure on your mind, and what's causing you to make this video in the first place? And it's largely due to the fact that recently I've been taking on lots of new pursuits and endeavors, and as a result, because I'm new in these areas, it becomes a lot more obvious that I don't have the skills or the competency in these areas yet, and as a result, failure is a lot more prevalent, and it's a lot more obvious that I have a long way to go in these areas. And if you're like me, taking on these things, and you're starting out in something, this is at the point where you fail most rapidly, but it's also at the point where you grow most rapidly. I've recently started practicing some public speaking because I've always felt that it was an area of discomfort, something I wasn't very good at, and as a result, I'm in that kind of level 1 stage where there's a lot to learn and mistakes are very common. In addition, I've recently recorded my first ever podcast, which is something I'm likely to release on this particular channel, so stay tuned for that and subscribe if you're interested. But like I said, it's something that's relatively new, so I expect the first attempt to be a little below par, even though overall for a first attempt it's not a bad effort. Again, it's very important to remind yourself that the beginning is often the hardest part, and this is why we experience things like imposter syndrome, because we start a new job and it feels like we're out of our depth, we're not very qualified. But again, when you fast forward time, it's only in that kind of hindsight, retrospective viewpoint that you can see that this is just a natural and necessary part of the journey. Because that feeling of failure and inadequacy is so high at the start, this is what leads most people to quit very early on. And this can be seen very frequently in social media, when people start up YouTube channels or any other social media accounts. But because the traction isn't building and it feels like you're not as good as you were hoping to be, and people often give up. But it's always important to remember that this is the point where you're going to be worst at that particular skill, and things are only going to improve over time if you stick with it. So the takeaway here is that if you knew you wanted to do this, but the reason that you're quitting is because of the immediate result, then it's usually good to give yourself enough time to persist through that initial discomfort until you reach a point where you're better equipped to make a more calculated long-term decision. There is one final thing that I've been thinking about relating to this, and it is on a more deep philosophical level, which is the whole purpose around enjoying something and failing at something, and how you often end up enjoying the thing that you're good at, but you only end up being good at something if you put enough time and energy into it. So when people say you should do what you enjoy, they're basically saying you should do what you're good at. But maybe there's something that you haven't yet developed that skill that you would like to be good at, and therefore you haven't yet anticipated that you're really going to enjoy it. So instead of asking yourself the question, what do I currently enjoy? You could ask yourself, what do you want to enjoy? Knowing that when you build up the initial skill set and the ability and the competency, you'll get to a point where you almost certainly will enjoy that thing. It kind of opens up the possibilities for different things that you currently don't do and that you could end up getting very good at in the future. Business and entrepreneurship is a very good example because nobody starting off with business knows what they're doing. They kind of have to figure out things as they go along, a lot of trial and error, and you have to make mistakes in order to get to a point where you grow a very successful business. So I'll leave you with this one. Your success in any kind of field will be largely determined by your relationship with failure, and you can build up that relationship either through introspection and understanding, or you can actually put it into practice and fail often, and more importantly, fail smartly. So if you like this video or got something from it, I'd appreciate if you like, subscribe, or even leave a comment down below, or any combination. But for now, I will continue making these videos until I reach a point where I can't take the failure anymore. But for now, I'll see you in the next video.